Okay, welcome everybody once again to a Wildlife for You wildlife class. Well, actually, it's not going to be a wildlife class today. It's actually going to be a plant or a tree class today. And as you can see from my title slide, my creative juices weren't really flowing too much when I created this because I couldn't come up with a really catchy phrase for today's presentation. Now, I did this class a couple of years ago, and even back then, I couldn't come up with a catchy phrase. So I I titled this class Trees, Trees, and More Trees because what we're going to do today is we are going to do a very basic introductory class and hopefully teach you about some trees. Now, as you know, with every class, I always, whoops, I always make sure that people are aware of the teacher and his experience. Y'all know who I am. I'm Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been working in the field for 25 plus years, doing mostly wildlife work, but obviously if you work with wildlife, you also have to know about habitats. And so knowing the different plants and vegetation, and yes, trees, is part of the job. Now, I will tell you, by no means am I an expert in trees, but I know enough to be dangerous and to be able to teach you some of the basics. So as on a side note, one of the students or one of the people in today's class is one of my swap students. And so Tina, I just want to let you know this photograph here of me, that was actually our very, very first swap class in 2017 when we brought students to New Mexico. So anyway, to get underway with today's presentation, what I wanted to start with is to let you know we're going to be talking about trees. And as you can imagine, trees come in all sorts of crazy shapes, different sizes, different colors. There's just a tremendous variety of tree species out there. And there is no way in heck that I'm going to spend the next 60 minutes and teach you everything you know, everything you need to know about trees. Because believe it or not, folks, there's classes, like college classes, that just are about trees. I took one of those classes a long time ago, back in early 90s. Actually, it might have been late 80s. But is my Dendrology 101 class. And that wasn't the only tree class there was. That was an introductory tree class. And you can imagine the number of hours you spend learning about trees. And that was just the basics. And so the main thing here is what I'm going to teach you over the next 60 minutes is going to scratch the surface. If you want to learn more, there's so many avenues for you to learn more, whether or not you're in college, or you can find different books about it, or potentially different things or videos on YouTube or wherever. Make sure you know your source and you have a knowledgeable tree person, but this is going to be very, very basic. And so what I like to do whenever I'm teaching any new concept, any new animal, any new idea, I like breaking it down to the very basics. So what I find is, if you hold on one second, got to mute someone. What I find is if you understand how things work, it makes it so much easier to then remember things moving forward. Because if I just throw 100 different tree species up here and ask you to memorize them, it's a near impossible task. But if you have an understanding of how things work, then it makes it much more easier. Things will begin to click and you can break things into more sizable chunks for your brain. And then things will line up, and it makes remembering these trees so much easier because you can create these connections that will cause you to remember things so much better. So one of the things I want to do is kind of teach you the very basic concepts of forests, kind of like forest ecology and why we end up with trees. And so where we're going to start with that is we are going to talk a little bit about this process called plant succession. And I'm going to show you some like higher level pictures and graphs to give you an understanding what we're talking about. This might be something you'll see in a high school or college textbook. But when we talk about plant succession, if you move across this diagram from the left to the right, left to right. Uh, think of the ground outside. And if we start with bare rocks and throw thousands and thousands of years of wear and tear on those ground bare rocks, we're going to end up with some soil. We're going to end up with some dirt. Now, the first types of plants that typically move in on the bare soil are these lichens or moss, these really low growing, very basic type of plants. And then it goes on from there, where the next plant to move in are these small annual plants. A little bit bigger than the lichens, but these smaller plants then get replaced by somewhat larger plants with these grasses and perennials. I also sometimes like to call them forbs. They're those small ground, low to the ground type of growing plants. And then things start growing up. We start getting some vertical height on things, and we begin to get like these taller grasses. Then you start to get shrubs, and then some small trees will move in. And then finally you get medium-sized trees and then large-sized trees. So it's just a temporal progression in the size of the plant that's on the landscape. And so that is how a forest is created. That ultimate, we call it a climax community. When you have pretty much all mature trees, that is the end of the line in plant succession. But guess what? Things don't stay static. It's not like once you get a forest, you're always going to have a forest, because what's going to happen? You're going to have some kind of disturbance event. In many cases, it's going to be a forest fire that comes in and destroys all the trees. It could be some crazy weather event, whether or not it's hurricane or tornado. They're going to create these openings, and it resets the plant succession. And once again, you're going to have pretty much bare ground. And then you're going to start that plant succession over again, where you first start with the grasses and perennials, then small shrubs, and it grows up to larger and larger trees until you get the climax forest again. And guess what, folks? That is how pretty much the ecosystem works. It just keeps growing to that climax forest, resetting itself, then growing again to that climax forest and resetting itself. So no matter where you are on the landscape, you're in one of those phases of plant succession. If you're standing in the middle of an open grass field, oftentimes, if you stay there long enough, decades and decades, you'll be standing in a closed canopy forest. But it takes a long, long time. But that's how plant succession works. And that's why we end up ultimately with these large trees, these forested environments. Now, the question here is, why does one species replace another? Why doesn't something just grow up to be grass, and it'll just stay grass, and you don't get this other plant succession? Well, depending on what part of the country you're in, a lot of it has to do with this thing called shade tolerance. I hate getting all techie and nerdy and real showing my biologist backside of mine, but when we're talking about shade tolerance, it's something we had to learn in college about why plants do what they do. But to describe what I mean with the shade tolerance, let's start with an open grass field. The grasses, they love full sun, and they're going to do well in full sun. And so over time, it could take a couple of years, it could take a decade or more, you're going to start getting taller and taller shrubs in there. So you're going to get this mid-succession stuff. You're going to get these small shrubs or potentially small trees in there. And the problem is, once those trees grow up, or once those shrubs grow up, they're going to cast shade on some of the grasses, and some of those grasses will die out. Well, guess what? As you keep going, you're going to get a different level of plant growth. Remember that whole phase, or that whole string of plant succession, you're going to get larger and larger plants. So once you get these mid-story trees coming up, guess what? They cast shade on these smaller plants. And guess what? They're not shade tolerant. And so they'll die out. They need that full sun. And so this is where you get that mid-successional growth. And then finally, what's going to happen is you're going to get some tree species moving in there that are extremely shade tolerant. They can grow in shade, but when these trees grow up, you have this large climax forest and they create shade all underneath and nothing else can grow in there. You might possibly get some smaller trees of that species because they're extremely shade tolerant. But for the most part, these climax forests, there is not a lot of plant life underneath because most plants require a fair amount, if not full sunlight. And so that's partly why or how that whole process of plant succession works. So the question here is, why the heck am I telling you all this? What does this have to do with trees or identifying trees? Well, here it is, folks. If you know how the forests come to be, and another key part is if you also know where you are geographically, it's going to help you identify what trees are on the landscape. And I'll give you an example of that. Remember, I was talking about climax forest. These are the last trees that when you get a full-blown forest, these are the last trees standing. Now, when I say the last trees, there's always going to be a few oddball trees here and there. But the dominant, when we're talking about climax forests, we're talking about forests that are dominated by certain tree species. And so I'll give you an example. Geographically, if you're on the eastern coast, one of the climax tree species, which you're liable to find anywhere on the East Coast, is American beech. And I'll show you what American beech looks like. If you're in this Pacific Northwest region, can anyone guess? You can type or call out, but can anyone guess what the climax species is there? I won't wait too long since we got such a small class. But as you can imagine, redwoods, those giant redwoods, the biggest trees that you're going to find in a forest are going to be those climax tree species. So you get redwoods. So here again in the Northeast, besides the possibility of beech, if you're looking at a type of pine species, eastern hemlock is a climax species in that northeastern area. And so if you're seeing a lot of these older pines and you know what part of the country you're in, it gives you a hint as to what trees to expect. Here in the Rockies, and I actually circled my favorite area, and I live in that yellow circle. If you look at a climax species, especially higher elevation, what we're going to find is a lot of Douglas fir. There's also a lot of ponderosa pine in there. Going back to the east, a big tree species or a family of trees that you might find as a climax species are going to be the maples, sugar maples, red maples. You're going to get a whole slew of maples in there. And then last but not least, not to leave out our Canadian friends, you move further north and you get into some fir species. Balsam fir is a huge climax species in that part of the world. So knowing what area you're in will definitely help you identify what species you should expect in that area. But it's more than just geography. So one of the things that we should look at and have to look at is climate, because certain tree species do better in certain climates. And when I'm talking about climate here, I'm more or less talking about the environmental conditions. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use an example from the Southern Rockies to demonstrate these environmental conditions and how they dictate certain tree species. So you have to understand, with elevation, there's a drastic change in a couple of environmental conditions. With an increase in elevation, not only are you getting colder temperatures, but you're also getting wetter environments. So the change in elevation often dictates what trees you're going to find there. And so let's start again with this Southern Rocky example. If you're out west, oftentimes when you're in that, remember, out west, a lot of times the valleys are still pretty high, but when you're below 7,500 feet, 7,500 feet, which is extremely high in the East Coast, you don't rarely get over 7,000 feet in the East Coast, but out west, it's quite common. The primary tree that you find in those western landscapes is going to be this pinyon juniper. And so the forest will be dominated by pinyon juniper type of trees. Now, as you move up in elevation, the weather would change, or the climate changes a little bit. Like I said, it's a bit cooler. Now in the west, it's still pretty dry, but when you get between this, say 7,000 to 8,000 foot elevation, you get a ton of this tree. This is ponderosa pine. I don't want to say it loves to burn, but it has adapted very well to being in areas that burn frequently. In fact, the way they grow in clumps instead of huge dense forests allows them to adapt to this more fire adapted conditions. Now, when you increase in elevation above 8,500 feet, you are then going to get a different change in those climatic conditions or environmental conditions. And so what you'll see oftentimes in this range, this is where you're starting to go from a drier type of climate to starting to get more moisture in. And so between that 8,000 and 9,500 feet, we get a lot of what's called mixed conifers, because we have some dry areas in there. So you have pines that really like the dry conditions, but we also have some wet conditions in there. So we have these mixed conifers. There's trees that are adapted to both those wet conditions as well as those dry conditions. Now, remember, this is not just conifer. You might actually have some aspen in there. Aspen are extremely well adapted for this elevation. And then when you get above that, you start really getting into, I can't breathe anymore because I'm out of shape type of elevation. When you're getting above 9,000 feet to 12,000 feet, you start seeing, once again, a different kind of tree species, and it's usually spruce and fir trees. And so those trees are very well adapted to wet conditions, to very cold conditions, to really, really difficult environmental conditions. You get much more wind effect up there. In fact, once you go above 12,500 feet, a lot of the forests die out because it becomes too harsh. But it just goes to show that knowing or identifying your trees would be hugely beneficial to you if you knew exactly where you were and what trees you're likely to find at different elevations, or what trees you're likely to find in different geographic areas. So if you understand your forested ecosystems, it will absolutely help you identify trees. And so what we're going to do, we're going to jump into some basic, very, very basic tree identification. Before we get into that, does anyone have any questions about pretty much how we go from like a grassland landscape all the way to forest, and how forests kind of have specific trees to that ecosystem? If not, I'll keep going on. Okay, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about tree identification. Now, I will tell you, the best thing you can possibly do is go to the store and buy some books, get some guides. Peterson Field Guide is great. Whatever guides you want to buy, the thing that I would highly, highly recommend is buy a guide that is adapted or suited for your area. So if you know you're going to be going on a hike in Yellowstone, you would buy a guide for Western species. Same thing on the East Coast. If you're going to Great Smoky Mountain National Park, obviously get one that is really going to focus in on those trees found in that area. Because if not, you would more or less be carrying an encyclopedia around, because there's so much information that you could learn about individual trees and tree species. And with North America being so robust with their ecosystems, it would be too much information. So help yourself out and get tree guides that are specific to your area, and it will definitely make your tree identification much easier if you're filtering out trees that aren't even found in your area. So the cool thing is you get those tree guides and you will quickly fall in love with trees. Those are actually some of my swap students from that 2017 trip. So, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to use many of the tree guides that you can buy. Now, I will tell you, some of them just have pictures where you got to flip through. You kind of have to know a little bit about your trees to be able to find what you're looking for. But probably the most beneficial guides that you can get to help you identify trees will talk about a dichotomous key. And just so you know, a dichotomous key pretty much gives you, is it this or is it that? And you keep answering those very, very simple questions, and it leads you to the ultimate answer. So for example, you could get a tree guide for your area, and the first question may very well be, is the leaf like a needle, or is the leaf broad and flat leaf? And so literally, just so you know, what they're trying to find out, is it a pine tree or is it a deciduous tree? Or is it a conifer or deciduous? And so if you choose like the leaf you're looking at, if it looks like a needle, it will tell you to go to page 2. If it looks like this broad flat leaf, it will tell you to go to a different page, possibly page 36. Then when you turn to page 36, say you had a flat leaf and you turn to page 36, it's going to say, okay, is the leaf that you're looking at, is it simple or is it compound? Now, you have to understand that there are going to be some terms that are used that you will have to learn what they mean. So in this particular instance, a simple leaf is just one solid shape, where a compound leaf usually have multiple little leaflets coming off of it. And so looking at the leaf in your hand, you then go to either page 37 or page 44. And so the thing that you have to understand, and again, this is just the basics, but you're going to have to learn some of those terms that the tree guide will be asking you to identify. And so we're not gonna spend a ton of time on this, but just so you know, it can get into some finer details. And so just looking at a simple leaf, it might ask you a question about, is the apex pointy or is it rounded? Is the midrib hairy or is it smooth? Is the petiole split or is it one? And so the good thing with these tree guides is they will absolutely have a glossary that explains all these. So it's not like you have to look these up beforehand, then get a tree guide. It will explain all this, but the main thing I want to tell you is it will go into some detail. So it's not going to be like an ABC first grader book where it's super, super simple with just pictures. Sometimes in order to identify specific tree species, you have to get very, very detailed and know what you're looking at. So another example is that they might talk about are the leaf margins. And there's lots of nerdy, if you're into nerdism biology, just pick up a tree guide, because they're gonna have some awesome terms that you can impress your friends and family and say, hey, I saw a leaf today and it was overly lobate, and they'll have no idea what you're talking about, but you can flash your brilliance to them whenever you want. Anyway, lots of different terminology that they will use in these tree guides, but it's super simple because they'll explain it. It just might take a while for you to get good at it. So besides leaf margins, or like what the edges of the leaf look like, sometimes they'll talk about the arrangement of the leaves. For example, alternate arrangement. You see how you have a leaf section here and then here, and it's not ladder-like. They don't grow opposite of each other. See, if you look, I just said opposite. If you look at opposite leaf arrangement, the leaves grow opposite each other. Here's spiral arrangement or whorled. And so it can get nerdy really, really quick. And I love it because if you're into it, and if you're into identifying trees, it's so not just fascinating, but it's so powerful to be able to go through this whole thing and actually end up on identifying the exact species you're looking at. So understand that when it comes to identifying these different trees, obviously sight is going to be the primary sense that you use, because you're going to be looking at these leaves. But believe it or not, you're also going to be using feel, because sometimes it will ask you, is the leaf rough or is it smooth? So you're going to have to feel the leaf. Another thing that you might have to do, you might have to smell it. And so hopefully your sniffer is better than mine. I got a horrible sense of smell. And once in a blue moon, I don't know how many books tell you to taste it, but when Robert Brewer, my colleague back in Tennessee, whenever I go on a hike with him, he's chewing on leaves to help him identify things. It's pretty interesting that you could use such a wide gamut of your senses in order to identify trees. So that's why oftentimes you see people doing this, because they're trying to figure out what kind of tree it is. And just so you know, so I can explain this picture to you, does anyone know what they're doing there? If you can't guess the tree, that is very good, Dan. That is a big old ponderosa pine. Absolutely, it's one of my favorite trees. And when they get this big, oftentimes they're nicknamed yellow bellies. But you can stick your nose in the crevice, and it's such a sweet smell. Some people say it smells like vanilla. Some people say it smells like cherry, but it's the most heavenly smell to stick your nose in a big old yellow belly ponderosa pine. Jan, if I could ask you really quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, but what do you mean stevia? Jan put in the chat box she tasted stevia yesterday when is that the type of plant, and what does it taste like?
I guess it'd be more of an herb. It does grow fairly large, but it's a plant that is so sweet. And you can buy it in packets in the grocery store, but I like natural things. You can sweeten a pitcher of tea with like one leaf crushed up, or
Awesome. I don't know what that is. That would be really cool. I'd love to.
I'll take a picture of it and send it to you on Facebook Messenger. It's really neat. And people that are diabetics or want natural things instead of artificial sweeteners can use it. And I had a friend from out of town. She wasn't familiar with it, and she likes homeopathic natural things. And I had her taste a leaf, and I said, you could put 3 leaves in a gallon of tea and sweeten it instead of all the sugar and stuff.
Yeah.
So I'll make a note to send it to you.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah, it'll
Okay,
blow
bye.
you away. So many different trees and plants out there. People walk by all the time and don't realize.
And I'll add another one. It didn't surprise their Freeze-ageddon in February, unfortunately, but I had a lemon eucalyptus I bought as a little 1 gallon, and it grew to be a 50-foot tree fairly quickly. And it smells like, if you crush the leaves, like lemon and eucalyptus. And I used to use it to make natural cleaning product, but it will keep mosquitoes out of a fairly large area around it just naturally.
Yeah, so that's awesome. That's why I highly encourage folks to get different plant books, different tree books, and then you could learn all these tricks of the trade. So what I'm going to do is, hey, Trish, just so you know, I smell vanilla. A lot of people will say cherry, but needless to say, it's a sweet smelling tree when you stick your nose in that crevice. I'm laughing here because I just saw Tina provided a comment. Tina, do you recall what plant that was when we did our student trip back in May of this year? Robert had the students smell some type of plant because it had a very distinctive smell to it. And poor old Tina smelled it, and it triggered her allergies that almost really knocked her on her butt for a couple of days. So yeah, don't trust my colleague, Robert Brewer, because sometimes he has you smell things that might not be too pleasant. I promise if you ever go on a hike with me, I will only give you sweet smelling stuff. Okay, moving on. So one of the things that we're going to do over the last half of this class is we're going to look at individual leaves, individual trees, and learn identification. And so, as most of you know, there's 2 main groups of trees. There's those deciduous trees, which has a whole slew of different tree species under it. When we're talking deciduous trees, we are talking these broadleaf trees like number 1, 2, 9, 7, all those flat leaves that drop in the wintertime. They shed their leaves, they go dormant, then they grow a new leaf the following spring. The other big group of trees are what we call coniferous trees. These are pretty much the pine trees, and they hold their leaf or their needles year round. And so, believe it or not, they still shed them, but they shed them sporadically. And so if you go underneath any pine tree, you will see hordes and hordes of pine needles underneath that pine tree because it's continuously shedding and regrowing needles. And so it's not like they never lose their needles. They just do it year round, whereas deciduous trees drop them all at once and then grow them all anew again in the following spring. And so what we're going to do, we are going to start with deciduous trees first. And I will ask, Dan, I know you, I believe, are going to be probably one of the more advanced tree identifier people. So as I'm going through this class, if there's a particular tree that you know a neat trick to help you remember it, or neat characteristic about it, for example, if you rub the bark between your fingers, it burns. Hopefully we don't have any of those trees. But if anyone out there, not just Dan, but if anyone has any really good tips on remembering these trees, by all means, share them with the group. So let's jump in here, and we're going to first take a look at deciduous trees, and we're going to go one by one and talk about these. So just so you know, it typically is known that the eastern half of North America has a lot of deciduous trees. They also have pine trees, but most of the deciduous trees are in the eastern half. Then when you get into those western landscapes, it is pretty much dominated by conifers or pine trees, but there are also deciduous trees there. So a lot of these trees can be found anywhere, but they're, for the most part, a lot of these deciduous trees will be primarily found in the east. And I'll point out which ones tend to be found more out west. But let's start with the ash tree. And so one of the more common trees that you might find out in the wild is this white ash, Fraxinus americana. Now, it has this compound leaf here, which you can begin to recognize it. But there's going to be some other tree species that have a similar looking leaf. What I always find the most useful for identifying this white ash is the bark. It has a very diagonal type of bark. It has some deep grooves, but it has this almost like a honeycomb pattern to it with these very deep grooves, and it is very indicative of ash. Now, I'm going to quiz you. You can type it in. Let's not turn on the microphone yet, but if you want to type it in, I'll go through some quiz questions. Does anyone know what sport uses the wood from the white ash tree, and how do they use it? Very good, Dan. Fantastic. At one point, almost every single baseball bat that is milled out there was milled out of white ash. It is an extremely dense wood, and so it makes for fantastic baseball bats. And so that is one of the cool uses that I find for white ash. One of the big problems nowadays, if you've ever heard of the emerald ash borer, it is an introduced insect that is wiping out white ash on the East Coast as fast as we can imagine, which unfortunately is going to be one of the biggest, one of the worst things for all these tree species is there's a lot of introduced diseases or insects, which is really wreaking havoc on a lot of these tree species. Oops. Okay, so that was white ash. Let's move, and just so you know, I'm going through these alphabetically, I believe. So the next one is quaking aspen. And again, there's going to be multiple species within these, and so I'm just giving you one of the primary species. So there's different varieties you'll find. But quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides, is one of my favorites. I kind of like that name. But you'll know why it's called quaking aspen. If you ever see an aspen tree and you just have the slightest of breezes, the entire tree vibrates. And so those leaves, I don't know what part of the design caused them to tremble like they do, but it's really nice. If you're ever in a aspen forest and you just have the gentlest of breezes, the leaves just shake and they rattle. Very, very easy to identify tree with the white bark, but this is one of the dominant deciduous trees in the western half of North America. Now it is high elevation, you're not going to find them down low, but when you're up in those pine forests and you hit a certain elevation, you suddenly enter the world of aspen trees, and they're gorgeous. They have this bright yellow color in the fall, but really, really cool tree, a very dominant tree in the western half of the US. Okay, a beech tree. Well, probably the most common beech tree is this American beech, Fagus grandifolia. The leaves on it are pretty distinctive, and for a couple of reasons. But probably the main reason people can identify this tree is the bark. It has a very smooth bark. And just like an aspen tree, I didn't mention this, but an aspen tree, sadly, when it's near any human development, you see a lot of people carving their initials. Well, the American beech is the initial carving king of the world, because in the East Coast, whenever people see this blank, smooth canvas, they take it upon themselves to write who their love of their life is in this tree. But I'm sure most of you can recognize American beech when you see that smooth, smooth gray bark. A cool thing with American beech, they have these, if you can see how the leaves are growing, they're growing alternate, although that one doesn't look it. Smooth type of leaf. But the thing that's interesting is they tend not to drop their leaves in the fall. So if you're walking around the eastern forest and you see this smaller bush on the ground and it's still holding their leaves, even though they turn all brown and they're crisp and crinkly, they tend not to lose those leaves until the new leaf starts growing that following spring. So it's one of the few deciduous trees where they really hang on to their leaves for a long, long time. Oh, I am so sorry. I'm going to go back. Trish asked a question. Oh my gosh, I got to go back to this. One of the things that is really cool about the aspen tree is the way they propagate, the way they grow new trees are through these root suckers. And oftentimes you'll be walking in a western forest and you'll come upon an aspen stand. And lo and behold, when they do genetic testing on those, all those trees are showing the exact same genetics, which more or less says they're all interconnected underground, and it's like one giant tree. And what Trish mentioned, Pando is an aspen stand that is not far from where I live here. It's kind of cool. I actually saw it a couple of months ago. It covers, I believe, over 600 or 800 acres, and it's all presumed to be one tree. They're taking these genetic, they're doing genetic tests on clippings from one end of the valley to the other, and they're identical. And they nicknamed that aspen stand Pando. And it is actually believed to be one of the largest single beings in the world. Now, there's some thought that it's I think this mushroom or this fungus, or it's hard to classify the largest because is it volume, is it weight, how do you classify it? But very good for bringing that up, Trish. I forgot to mention that. Thanks for sparking my memory. Okay, American beech, smooth bark. Birch trees, popular in the east, mostly in the northeast. You usually get more birch when you go higher in latitude. Not all that crazy unique type of leaf on it, but what is unique is the bark. And so when you see bark growing like this and it begins to peel backward, it looks, I don't know why the term papyrus always comes to my mind, but it's very papyrusy. Well, if you look at the scientific name, it's Betula papyrifera. So I guess that is where they got the original papyrus. But it's easy to identify. And there's a number of different species. There's white birch, yellow birch, swamp birch, all different kind of birch species. But it's really typically the easiest to identify because of that peeling bark that they have right there. Okay, moving on. Dogwoods. The only reason dogwoods aren't really like a super duper common dominant tree, but if you live in the Southeast, you've got to learn to recognize them because people love their dogwoods in the Southeast. A really cool thing. This is one where you finally start to get really key characteristics in the actual leaf. So if you look at the venation in these dogwood leaves, it's rather unique. There's only a couple other species that do this, but this it's called parallel venation. And so it's not absolutely parallel, but you can see that the veins, for the most part, other than the long elongated curve, they run fairly parallel to each other and meet at that rib line. They have an absolutely beautiful flower, this four-petaled leaf that most people know and love the dogwoods for. The flowering dogwood is probably the most popular. Kind of cool looking bark. It kind of looks like it's covered in coins or something like that. But this is a very common tree in the South, Cornus, Florida. That's the flowering dogwood. Now, a tree that unfortunately has definitely reduced in its numbers tremendously over the last 200 years, or last 100 years actually. Excuse me, the American elm, Ulmus americana. This was a predominant tree in the eastern half of the US, but there was once again an introduced disease that wiped out so many of the American elm, and it's called Dutch elm disease. And I believe it's a fungus, don't quote me on that, but tremendously negative impact on elm. But you still do find American elm if you're out and about. The cool thing, and I love it, once again, it has a leaf that is very distinctive, and it's distinctive for two reasons. First off, you see this, the bottom of the leaf is irregular. It does not, I'm sorry, I'm reading Jan's question. I don't know the answer to that, Jan. I'm not exactly sure which tree you're referring to. But going back to the elm, it has this very irregular base to the leaf. You can see it is not matched on either side. But the thing that really, really helps me identify elm trees is when you grab this leaf, especially the leaf of a young tree, and you rub it, it feels like sandpaper. And certain species of elm are more coarser or rougher than others, but the elm leaf is awfully rough, and if you do feel it, it will feel like you're rubbing sandpaper. Their bark is not very telltale. So once again, I usually use the leaf to help identify this tree. All right, moving on. There's a whole host of hickories out there. I'll show you one. I'll show you shagbark hickory. But the main thing with hickories is they have these compound leaves. Now, some of them have these 5 leaflets, some will have 7, but for the most part, they're really, really big leaves. But they're all pretty much going to be this compound leaf structure. And once again, having a tree ID book is absolutely going to help you identify it down to the exact species. This is where they might have you counting the number of leaflets, might have you looking at the petiole or the tip of the leaf or the midrib or something like that. That's where it gets into finer detail. But for the most part, hickories will have some type of compound leaf. Some of them have really cool barks. The reason I showed you shagbark hickory is it's really easy to identify. You get bark like this, and right away, you sometimes don't even need to look at the leaf because you know this is shagbark hickory. Very, very beneficial for a number of forest dwellers. For example, bats oftentimes require or need this loose fitting bark in order to crawl up under and rest for the night. Sometimes they use the same trees throughout the whole summer. Sometimes they change trees every day, but this loose fitting bark is really beneficial for a number of bat species. Okay, another tree which is really cool, the honey locust, Gleditsia triacanthos. This has a really cool leaf, very, very, very compound leaf. So you see all those little, I believe this is the whole leaf, but all these individual leaflets are also compound. So it's crazy detailed, real tiny leaflets here. It almost looks fern-like. But another thing that really sets this honey locust apart are oftentimes the thorns you find on the honey locust. This triacanthos means it pretty much has 3 stems to those thorns. You have the mid stem and two other stems shooting off from the side. And so, all right, I'm going to tell something on myself. I was a horrible college student. Well, I shouldn't say horrible. It depended on what class. If I was interested in the class, I was really good. If I wasn't interested, not so good. I wanted to be really interested in trees, anything biology. And so I really had to study hard and come up with unique ways of remembering things. So I would come up with the goofiest little sayings to help me remember these things. And this is how effective they are, because I took dendrology back in early 1990s, and trying to remember the honey locust, I would come up with a dumb saying. And for example, honey, watch out for the thorns. And it would, as soon as I'd see the thorns, I'd think, honey, watch out. And then it's like, oh, it's a honey locust. Okay, enough stupid sayings on my part. No, I don't. I'll probably tell you 1 or 2 more, actually. Okay, moving on. Magnolia, southeastern tree species that is highly prized, and so many people love their southern magnolias. Really awesome leaf. It's a large leaf. It's very smooth. It's almost waxy, but they have these big, very succulent type of leaf. But the thing that really identifies this tree is this oversized blossom. It's like a giant, like when I say a giant rose, it's much bigger than a typical rose, but these beautiful white blossoms. Now, different magnolias will have different color leaves. One of the coolest things, and this is just total randomness here, one of the coolest things I ever saw was an ice storm that we had in Tennessee, where it was very misty out, and that mist was freezing. And we had a magnolia tree in our yard, and I could go out to that magnolia tree and literally break off a complete, it was like, it was the most beautiful ice leaf that I would find. And the whole tree was covered with them, because the dew was just constantly manufacturing these ice leaflets on me. So sorry for that random trivia. Jan has a really good tip there. I did not know that, but she said magnolia blooms smell like lemon lime. So that is a wonderful tip. Thanks for sharing that, Jan. And I'm sorry, I see your hand raised now. Is that for the magnolia bloom? Awesome. Okay, so southern magnolia, most people could recognize that. Okay, more of a northeastern tree, but it's also found all the way down to Florida. It is definitely primarily an East Coast tree, are the maples. And you could have sugar maple, red maple, silver maple, lots of different kinds of maples. Maple leaves, I personally think they're very easy to recognize because I played hockey growing up, and the maple leafs, it's just real easy for me to identify a maple leaf. You have this standard pattern of these 3 main lobes, but then you have these jaggedness off those 3 main lobes. but a typical maple leaf look. Now, all the different maple trees will have different type of patterns or textures to their bark. But once again, that is where a tree book will definitely help you narrow down to the exact species. But this is definitely one of those climax species. If you're in a mature forest in the east, some of the largest trees in that forest will be maple trees. The other large tree in the eastern forest is going to be this guy. And we're going to actually talk a little bit more about this because they're such a dominant tree. So I put up here the white oak, Quercus alba, but the white oak, it is a particular tree species, but it's also a family. There's the white oak family, and then there's a red oak family. So we're going to start with the white oak family. This white oak family, if you can identify an oak leaf, they can be highly variable, but for the most part, most of the oaks have a somewhat similar looking leaf. But the main key here that I want you to look at is the edge of the leaf. You can see how it's smooth and rounded. Whenever you see these oak leaves that have this round edge to it, you're dealing mostly with the white oak family, and they produce some wonderful acorns or acorns, depending on what dialect you use. But the reason I bring this up is oak trees produce these nuts. We sometimes refer to it as hard mast, and this is what carries a number of wildlife species, from bears to deer to turkeys to birds to small mammals to mice, you name it. They gorge themselves on acorns or this hard mast supply. And because white oak are such a dominant tree species in the east, wildlife has grown to become dependent on it. The cool thing with the white oak family, remember the oaks with these smooth leaves, they produce an acorn that is fairly sweet. There's not a lot of tannic acid in it, so the wildlife love it. When a white oak tree begins dropping its acorns, stick around that tree because wildlife is going to come to feed there. They love white oak acorns. The bark is pretty characteristic. It's a cool looking bark. I don't really know how to describe it, but once you get a hang for it, you can tell which trees are white oaks without even having to look at the leaves. So that was the white oak family. Now let me talk a little bit about the red oak family. This particular species, Quercus rubra, is one of multiple red oak, one of multiple species in the red oak family. And if you look at this leaf, if you notice here, that edge of the leaf comes to a point. In almost every species within the red oak family, you have these pointed leaves. And so they too produce an acorn, but typically the acorns in the red oak family have much higher tannic acid, a level of tannic acid, which makes them more bitter. So they are not the preferred food source. So if you have a forest with white oak trees and red oak trees, the animals are going to gobble up the white oak first. And then when they get really hungry, if they're looking for food later, they can eat the red oak trees because they'll last on the ground longer. Another really cool, I don't want to spend too much time, a really cool feature is the white oak acorns mature in 1 year. So they come out in the spring, they produce that acorn, and it drops that fall. The red oak, on the other hand, it's a 2-year maturation process. And so when it begins growing in the spring, it's going to hold that acorn that first year, and it does not drop it until the second year. What is so cool and miraculous about that is oftentimes we have some bad weather events, especially in the springtime, where you get a really hard frost that might kill the buds on a lot of trees. You could have years where you get this horrible frost weather event in the spring, and it really wreaks havoc on the white oak trees because it knocks off all their blooms, and you don't have much white oak production. And that would be detrimental to the wildlife if there was no acorns for that year. But because red oak hold on for 2 years, that frost doesn't kill them. They're still on that tree, and then they're going to drop that year. So Mother Nature has built in these fail-safe systems to pretty much make sure there's food for wildlife all throughout the years, depending, no matter what the weather throws at them. Now, red oak, you can begin to identify some of the oaks with their bark. Not as distinctive as that white oak, but you can definitely learn to identify. In fact, if you get really good, you can even take a piece of lumber that you find at Home Depot or Lowe's, and you can identify what tree it is based on the look of the grain inside the tree. So fascinating stuff. Okay, going back. Patricia said, excellent book, Nature of Oaks by Douglas Tallamy, and Dan seconded. So I will recommend it too, even though I don't have that in my collection. I got a bunch of tree books up there, but I do not have that one. But thank you for that input, Patricia. Okay. Poplar trees. If Robert Brewer was on here, he'd yell at me because a tulip poplar is within the magnolia family. I'm bringing up the tulip poplar because it is a climax species in eastern forests. Grows to be a gigundous tree, and it's really easy to identify, especially with the leaf. If you look at that leaf, it is in the shape of a tulip. That is why it's called tulip poplar, and it has one of my favorite scientific names, Liriodendron tulipifera. The bark's not super distinctive, almost looks like a muted ash type of bark, but once you see that leaf, you know you're dealing with a tulip poplar. Okay, really cool tree. I'm going to speed it up because I talk way too much. Sassafras, another really neat eastern tree. The thing that is so awesome about this tree is the leaf. I'll throw up the bark, but the leaf is beyond compare because it comes in all different shapes and sizes. There's 3 primary shapes to the leaf. If you look here in the middle, you have this trilobed leaf. So 3 parts to this leaf. Then you have other leaves that look like a mitten. And then sometimes you have just a single lobe. So whenever you see this tree, you usually think all the leaves look alike. Not so with the sassafras tree. And yes, you can use this to make sassafras tea. Sweet gum, another big tree in the east. And so liquid ambar styraciflua, another favorite name of mine. Very distinctive leaf. It looks kind of, I was going to say, it looks kind of like a maple leaf, but with the 5 prongs there, some people think it looks like another kind of leaf that I'm unfamiliar with. But the one identifying feature that you absolutely will recognize are those sweet gum balls, those really thorny, prickly things that you scream when you step on them with bare feet. But really big tree, very beneficial tree. Bark is not very identifiable, but the leaf and the sweet gum balls definitely are. Sycamore, one of my favorite trees. Okay, I'm gonna tell on myself for another stupid saying here, but they have huge leaves. Very, very distinctive leaf. You don't see many leaves. It's obviously maple leaf looking, but they're extremely large. But the thing that gives this tree away, no matter what, is the bark. And you could tell it looks sickly looking. It's, oh, I think, Jan, this is what you were talking about. Now that I think of it, this is that green and white, that weird looking bark. It's a sycamore tree. And I often say, when you look at this tree, it looks sick. And so that's the easiest way to identify. You have the sickly looking tree, it's going to be a sycamore. Robert Brewer calls them a 60-mile-an-hour tree because you can identify this tree while you're driving 60 miles an hour because that bark is so distinctive. So that's a sycamore. Okay, walnut. Very, 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 what's the term? Not expensive tree, valuable tree. Juglans nigra. Walnut trees, there's a couple of different kinds of walnuts. Has the compound leaf, very distinctive leaf. When you look up and you see, it looks almost like a whole bunch of ladders up in the canopy. But the one thing you'll identify are these big fruiting bodies. The walnut is actually inside. The problem with the black walnut is when they start dropping these begin to rot, and there is, not only will they stain your driveway, but there's also a chemical in there that can, it's very detrimental to fish. And so you don't want to have a lot of black walnut trees if you're trying to have a pond. And so black walnut, like I said, extremely, extremely valuable wood product, makes beautiful, beautiful lumber. And I believe this is the last one since we are going alphabetical. The black willow, or a willow tree. There's lots of different species of willows. They usually have these long, narrow leaves, very identifiable. You find willows oftentimes in riparian areas. They do like to have a lot of water available. And so that, for the most part, are the primary deciduous trees you'll find. By no means is that all of them. So let me run through the conifers really quick, and then I'm going to quiz you. So when I'm talking about conifers, just so you know, remember, these are mostly pine trees. They tend to keep their needles or their leaves all year round. So first one is a cypress tree, bald cypress, Taxodium distichum. You see these in a lot of swampy areas in the east, especially in the southeast. Beautiful tree. It almost looks like the leaf is very feathery looking. Looks really, really cool. You get up there, they actually are pretty soft. So the leaf is wonderful, feathery looking type of leaf. What is very distinctive of this is they grow in very, very swampy areas, and you get these large protrusions from the tree. And when the water level drops, you'll even see some of the roots sticking up. They're called cypress knees, but they're very indicative of that swampy lowland Louisiana type of brackish water. Cedar trees, one of my favorites, and not because of the looks of the leaf, although the leaf is very distinctive. It's that scaly, prickly type of leaf. You all know cedars mostly from the cultivars that you plant in front of your house. But the thing I absolutely love about cedar trees is the wood itself. The bark oftentimes is peeling like this, but if you know your cedar trees and you cut a cedar tree, oh my gosh, they are the best smelling wood. They're very rot resistant, very resistant to insects, so they make fantastic fence posts. If you're doing construction, they're fantastic wood because they are rot and mold and insect resistant. Wonderful, wonderful tree. Bane of Texas ranches. Well, I love those cedar trees though. Okay, Douglas fir trees. Again, really, really high elevation tree in the West. Now that we're in the conifers, a lot of these are Western trees. So Pseudotsuga menziesii flows off your tongue. These are really high elevation trees. dominant tree in the West. The funny thing with Douglas fir, you look at the leaves here, you rarely get to see the leaves up close because they're such tall trees. Huge trees, obviously a tremendous tree for the lumber industry. Hemlock, this is a conifer that seems to be more common in the eastern half of the US, the eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis. Not a very, when you see the needles here, there's nothing too characteristic about it until you flip it over. When you flip it over, if you can look at the underside of a hemlock leaf or the needles, each one of those needles has these two white stripes on it. And so it's a very identifying feature of the eastern hemlock. The bad thing with this, the bark's not very identifiable, but the bad thing with eastern hemlock is right now they are suffering from another introduced species, the woolly adelgid, which is wreaking havoc with hemlocks. And it's extremely detrimental because hemlocks oftentimes grow around riparian areas, small, cool running streams. And they're huge trees that provide a tremendous amount of shade for that cool water system. And so if these trees die out, more sunlight hits that water, warms up the water, and then you have a loss of biodiversity. And so, yeah, it's a bad thing with all these introduced non-natives coming on board. Juniper tree. This is when I mentioned pinyon juniper before with the ecosystem. This is one of the dominant trees there. Juniperus monosperma, one-seeded juniper, found all over the West. Really scaly looking type of leaf there. Now there's a whole bunch of different kinds of junipers. The main thing with the junipers is they don't grow to be huge trees. You're seeing this picture here. It looks like a giant bush. That's the tree. They will get some girth to the actual trunk over time, but for the most part, they're short, interspersed throughout the landscape. And that's what the dominant landscape is. And a lot of that 5,000 to 7,500 foot elevation of the West. Pine tree, tons and tons of different pine trees. Ponderosa pine is one of those predominant pines in the West. That's when you go up in elevation a little bit. They are very, very fire adapted. They oftentimes grow apart from each other, makes them very, like if a fire comes through here, this large tree would be pretty safe from a ground fire. They have bark that can withstand that fire, might consume some of the smaller trees, and it keeps creating these openings in a healthy pine system, ponderosa pine system. Once again, their bark is wonderful. You stick your nose in that, you're going to smell some type of vanilla or cherry scent in it. The redwoods. I have not had the pleasure of seeing too many redwoods because I haven't spent too much time on that Pacific coast. But they're very similar with the scaly leaf system. But once again, with a lot of the redwoods, you're not going to see the leaves because you're going to see this thing. They're gigantic trees, some of the largest trees on Earth. And so I was reading up, you could read up about some of the individual trees and how old they are and how tall they are. But redwood is obviously one of the climax species on that Pacific coast. Spruce trees, there's a couple kinds of spruce. Usually when you're talking about spruce fir forest, the main difference between spruce and fir usually has a really soft, feathery type of needle, where spruce trees are prickly. Picea pungent. So besides smelling aromatic, the needles are pungent because they will prick you. And so if you go up to a tree, a young tree, and you don't know if it's a fir or a spruce, just grab the needles. And if it's going to be really firm and prickly, odds are it's going to be a spruce. If it's pretty soft and feathery, it will typically be a fir tree. So, okay, sick of trees yet? That's all I'm teaching you. Those are the main ones. So get your typing fingers ready, and I'm going to run through this quick because I've already talked over an hour. So I'm going to give you a quiz. Just type in your answer, and we'll see how well you do. I won't stick too long, so type fast. So you ready? All right. Here we go. What kind of leaf is that? Sassafras. Good one, Patricia. How about that? Okay, let me explain this. Very, very compound, relatively small leaflets here. I will add to it, it oftentimes has thorns. Very good, Trish. Honey locust. How about this one? What do you think this would be? The bark is very easy to identify with its smooth bark. Anyone? Very good, Patricia. Yes, that is a beech. It could look like an elm, but the elm has a much more, and I can't remember the term now, but asymmetrical bottom to it. This is fairly symmetrical on the bottom. So this is a beech leaf. Okay. What kind of leaf is this? It has it's a standard shape of this particular family, but notice the pointiness. Very good, red oak. This obviously is a pine tree. If you study your pines, you will be able to identify like certain pines. This is called a fascicle at the bottom, and some pines have 5 needles per fascicle. Some have 3, some have 2, some have short, some have long. But this is obviously a pine needle. Okay, what is this? What kind of leaf? They got the prickly the prickly balls that you don't want to step on. Very good. It's a sweet gum. A good guess with maple, Trish. Maple usually have a lot more jagged edges along the side, and usually only 3 main lobes. All right. This is the species oftentimes have lots of compound leaves. Hickory, very good, Patricia. Here's your maple, Trish. Yeah, I shouldn't say it has 3. It does have these 2 on the bottom. So you were right with the overall shape of the sweet gum, but the maple usually has much more indentation along the edge of it. Okay, going back to that general type of shape, but this one has rounded leaves. What kind of oak? Very good. All right, scaly. This could actually be a couple of different ones. Give me one that it could be. What kind of tree has leaves like this scaly leaf? Cedar. Very good, Patricia. And then what kind of tree has a long, narrow leaf like this? Likes to grow around water. Willow. Excellent. This one, when you look high up in the tree, it kind of looks ladder-like. It's a high valuable wood. Walnut. Excellent, excellent. This is in the magnolia family, even though it's called a poplar. But what kind of poplar? Tulip poplar. Very easy. And then very distinctive, if you look at the bottom, how asymmetrical it is. This leaf also feels like sandpaper. Wonderful. Well, there you go, guys. There's the last one. I want to thank you for putting up with me for well over an hour, where I didn't even scratch the surface of trees, but hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of how forests work. And if you pick up books that explain like the different geographic region, the conditions that the trees require, it will definitely help you narrow down the trees that you're thinking about. And then it's going to take some time, but pick up an identification, a dichotomous tree guide, where it will lead you to the exact species. It's going to be hard at first. There's no doubt about it. But until you learn to understand what they're asking for, it gets easier and easier and easier. And I tell you, it is so amazing when you can find a leaf and you can narrow it down, and then you find the exact tree it comes from. It is so rewarding. So with that, mark your calendars. Now, it is going to be 3 weeks until my next class because of the extra week here in this month. But the next class will be 3 weeks from today. It's going to be Wile E. Coyote. And this animal is often a lot of misinformation about it, a lot of misunderstanding about it, but they're still a wonderful species, a benefit to the ecosystem, although there's some not so pleasant aspects to coyotes, and we'll talk all about that. But anyway, next class is Wile E. Coyote. Y'all know how to find us on the web, or you can listen to our podcast, which we will get back to eventually one day. But for the most part, follow us on Facebook, and thank you so very much. And if anyone has any questions on trees, by all means, ask. I will just leave it here. Trish, that is front porch science. As far as the honey locust being poisonous, I've jabbed myself numerous times. Now, that's not to say that there might be some species because some things are poisonous to some species and not others. I know they don't pose a threat to humans from the poison side of thing, but yeah, I think that is that porch science that you referred to, but very good question. Jan asked, are the spiny balls of the sycamore tree? Oh, well, the sycamore, the sweet gum has those spiny balls too. Believe it or not, a lot of the wildlife use that. Squirrels will sometimes make use of those. We oftentimes look at things and say, oh, those are no good, those are of no use. And a lot of times when we classify things as being any good or of any value, we put it to value to humans. but there's oftentimes tremendous value to wildlife. Now, there are some trees that don't have much value to wildlife, but yeah, sycamore and sweet gum can be definitely made use of by some of the wildlife out there. Okay, well, I think that's done with the questions. Sorry for keeping you so long. I always go over, and I guess you should just always plan on an hour and 15 minutes. So you guys are awesome. Sorry I went so fast through this, but there's so much to learn and explore, and I'm going to leave that up to you. Get yourself some good guides, ask questions, reach out to other people that might know some things about trees, and enjoy your time out in nature identifying trees. So with that, I am going to stop the recording and bid you all a wonderful, wonderful night.